In the quietest hour before dawn, a man found a little girl holding a dying baby fleeing from a past carved by cruelty and fear. What started as a desperate act of protection turned into a story of silent strength, fragile hope, and a fight against a dark shadow that wouldn't let go. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more stories that grip your soul and don't let go. Now, settle in and let the story pull you into the dust and fire of the Wild West. They appeared in that hour when even the wind feels shy to touch the earth. The moment when dawn hangs like a held breath and the whole world balances between shadow and light. I was on the porch, coffee in hand, boots still damp from yesterday's frost, when I saw them standing there at the edge of my fence. A girl, maybe 6 or 7, barefoot on the cold ground, her dress stiff with old dust and something darker, and in her thin arms, a bundle so still it looked more like cloth than life. I remember not moving at first. I've lived alone long enough to know when silence means danger, but something in the way she stood, shoulders locked against fear, eyes too old for that small face, told me this wasn't danger coming to find me. It was something running from it. She didn't speak, and neither did I. That moment stretched out, soft as smoke. Then she stepped forward, slow, careful not to wake whatever lay in her arms. I saw the way her knuckles whitened around the bundle, how her lips moved in a whisper I couldn't hear. The light from my porch lamp caught her face just enough to show bruises along her cheek, fading but stubborn. I set the cup down and walked toward her, the boards underfoot creaking like they hadn't felt weight in too long. The baby in her arms didn't move, didn't cry, just lay there, small and blue-lipped, as if the world had already turned its back. And behind them both, like a ghost half swallowed by the night, came the mother-thin, wild-eyed, her dress torn open at the sleeve, dried blood on her collarbone. She walked as if every step cost her something she no longer had. I didn't ask questions. You learn out here that stories spill when they're ready. Instead, I opened the cabin door and stepped aside. The girl paused, looked at me with those ancient eyes, then crossed the threshold. The mother followed, slow, one arm wrapped tight around her ribs as if to hold herself together. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals, but the warmth still lingered. The girl knelt near the hearth, set the baby down on an old wool blanket, and pressed her ear to its chest. For a second, the whole world stopped. Then I saw it too, a flutter so small, it might have been my own hope tricking me, but it was there, life, fragile as a winter leaf. The mother sank down beside her, breathing hard, sweat shining on her brow despite the chill. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on that bundle, as though afraid to blink. I fetched water from the kettle, poured it into a tin cup, and set it within reach. My hands shook a little. It had been a long time since I'd had visitors, longer still, since any of them had needed me for something that mattered. The girl didn't cry, neither did the woman. Instead, there was this tight, desperate silence, like they'd run out of tears long before they got here. And maybe that's what pulled me in more than anything, the way they both kept breathing even after the world had tried to stop them. I crouched down to see the baby better. Pale skin, lips edged in purple, chest barely rising. I could smell old blood and damp cloth. I asked if the baby had a name, but the girl only shook her head once, quick and hard, like saying no out loud would break her. The mother whispered something I couldn't catch, then pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes wet but stubborn. Outside, the sky lightened by inches. Morning was coming, whether we wanted it or not. And so I did the only thing I could, moved slow, careful, found the small bottle I kept for calves too weak to suckle, warmed milk by the fire, and handed it to the girl. Her hands shook, but she took it. She fed the baby drop by drop, each breath held like it might be the last. In that quiet, I saw the shape of something bigger than fear. Hope, raw and bleeding, but alive. And for the first time in years, I wasn't just a man living alone on the edge of nowhere. I was a witness to something fighting to stay. The baby's eyelids twitched once, then again. The mother let out a breath that sounded like it had been stuck in her chest for days. The girl looked up at me, and in that look, I saw a question I couldn't yet answer. Will you keep us safe? I didn't speak. Instead, I stoked the fire higher, set more water to warm, and began to clear space by the hearth, because sometimes words don't matter. Sometimes only the promise in your hands counts. And so, in the hour when the land holds its breath, a stranger brought me a question wrapped in linen and silence, and without meaning to, I gave an answer. Morning arrived quiet but watchful, the kind of morning that feels like it's waiting to see what you'll do next. The sun hadn't yet crested the ridge, but gray light spilled into the cabin, turning everything soft at the edges. I remember the smell of ash and old wood, the way the fire crackled back to life under my hand, and the mother-daughter and that barely breathing child still curled together like a single wounded animal. I didn't know their names. Names felt too heavy to ask for just yet. Instead, I moved about the cabin in silence, keeping my boots light on the plank floor. I fetched more water, set the kettle over the flames, and gathered the scraps of bread and dried meat I had left. When I placed the food near the girl, she hesitated. Her eyes flickered to her mother, as if to ask permission. The woman nodded barely, and the girl reached out with hands that trembled from more than just cold. She ate slow, each bite small and careful, as though she feared the food might vanish if she moved too fast. The mother didn't touch hers at first. She sat with her back pressed to the wall, one arm wrapped protectively around the baby. Her face had a hollowness that spoke of more than hunger. It spoke of weeks, maybe months, of running, hiding, and hoping, in dark places where hope had no business living. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutter against the frame. I glanced toward the hills beyond my pasture, half expecting to see a rider crest the ridge, dust rising under hoofbeats. But there was nothing, yet just the silent weight of threat, unseen but felt in every heartbeat. I caught the girl watching me as I worked. Her eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone so young. She studied the way I poured water, the way I moved the kettle from the flame, how I kept my rifle propped within reach but not so close it looked like a threat. In that look, I saw someone who had learned to measure men quickly, and in her gaze I saw her decide that for now I was safe. I didn't ask where they'd come from or what had driven them here. I knew enough of the world to understand some questions come at a cost too high to pay before breakfast. Instead, I brought an old basin from the shelf, filled it with warm water, and set it on the floor by the hearth. I nodded toward it, a quiet offer. The mother didn't move at first. Then, as if her body remembered what dignity felt like, she set the baby down on the blanket, rolled up her sleeves, and dipped her bruised hands into the steam. The girl moved closer to the baby, hovering like a sparrow, unsure if the branch will hold. The baby's chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. I could see the way the mother watched each flutter, like she was counting the moments between. I'd seen that look before years ago, on a winter night when fever took my brother's youngest. That helpless, waiting fear that tears at your bones. I busied myself with chores that didn't need doing, checked the woodpile by the door, mended a crack in the window frame, swept dust that had settled overnight. But every few minutes, my eyes returned to them. It felt strange, after years spent in near silence, to share a space with 3 other beating hearts, even stranger to want them to keep beating. The mother washed her hands, then dabbed at the baby's face with a corner of cloth. The girl whispered something I couldn't hear, and for the first time, the woman's mouth softened at the cornice of memory of a smile, ghostly but there. It faded fast, buried under weariness. I set another log on the fire, sparks dancing upward like fleeting prayers. The kettle whistled low and I poured tea into a tin mug. I offered it to the woman. She took it with both hands, her fingers brushing mine skin rough and cold, but alive. She raised the cup, inhaled the steam, and for a moment her eyes closed. Relief, or maybe just the memory of it. The girl ate what was given without asking for more. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then folded the cloth napkin neatly, placing it on the floor beside her. Even in flight, she clung to small rituals of care. That told me plenty about the mother who raised her. The baby stirred, a sound like a sigh breaking through silence. The girl's eyes widened, hope and fear warring in that look. The baby didn't cry, still too weak for that, but its tiny fist curled tighter and its lips parted, drawing in a shallow breath. That small motion changed something in the room. The mother's shoulders lowered by a fraction, the girl's chest lifted like she'd been holding her own breath all night. Outside, a crow cawed from the fence post, a single harsh note in the morning hush. I stepped onto the porch, letting the door rest half open behind me. The frost had started to melt, dew sparkling on the grass like scattered glass. From here, I could see the empty road that wound past my land, the tree line beyond, and the hills rising behind them, stern and silent. I scanned the horizon, searching for a moving shadow, the glint of sunlight on metal, a swirl of dust that didn't belong. Nothing yet, but I knew enough to trust the feeling in my bones. Whoever they were running from wouldn't give up easily. When I stepped back inside, the woman looked at me for the first time, really looked. Her eyes were dark, rimmed with sleeplessness, but they held a question and a warning all at once. I met her gaze and nodded, slow and deliberate. I wouldn't ask. Not yet, but I wouldn't turn them out either. The baby made another soft sound, and the girl's face lit with something like wonder, then folded quickly into worry. She reached out, her hand hovering over the tiny chest, then pulling back before it could touch. Even love here had learned to ask permission. The mother's lips parted, as though to speak, but no words came. Instead, she turned her attention back to the baby, and in that silence, I heard everything she couldn't say. Fear, guilt, hope all tangled together like threads too tight to pull apart. I didn't tell them my name, didn't ask for theirs. In the quiet, there was an unspoken agreement. Some truths could wait until we were sure morning had truly come. The sun rose slow and red beyond the ridge, staining the sky with colors too bold for such a fragile moment. And in the warmth of that rising light, I felt something stir in me, a responsibility I hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse. They had come here on broken feet, carrying a question heavier than words. Will you keep us alive? And though I didn't speak it aloud, my hands answered, yes, as long as I can. Morning wore on, each minute stretching longer than it should, as though time itself was cautious to move around us. I kept myself busy with chores I'd done 1,000 times before, splitting, kindling, checking the fence line, brushing down my mare, but every task felt different now. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the cabin walls made me listen harder, watch closer. Inside, the girl had begun to explore, careful as a fawn in a clearing. Her small fingers traced the edges of the table, the worn arm of the rocking chair, the iron latch on the window. Not to steal, I realized, but to understand, to memorize the shape of this temporary safety in case it vanished. Her mother, though, barely moved from where she sat. The baby lay in her lap, wrapped tight, its breathing shallow but steady. The mother's gaze flickered between the door, the window, and her child over and over, like a needle caught in a single stitch. I stepped in from the cold, boots damp with morning dew. The girl turned to face me, chin lifted a fraction. It was the first time she didn't look away. Her eyes, dark and wide, were braver than her years allowed. And though no words passed her lips, the question was there, plain as daylight. Why are you helping us? I didn't answer. Instead, I took off my hat, set it on the peg by the door, and poured water from the kettle into a small tin cup. I brought it to the mother, holding it out until she raised her eyes to mine. For a heartbeat, something unspoken passed between you, something raw and human. Then, in a voice cracked and low from thirst and fear, she spoke. "Thank you," she rasped. The sound startled even her, I think. Her lips twitched, like she wasn't sure if they still knew how to move. Her gaze dropped back to the baby, but the words hung in the air, fragile and important. I nodded, the only reply that felt right. The girl watched this small exchange, her shoulders easing by a hair's breadth. Encouraged, perhaps, by her mother's attempt, she took a tiny step closer to me. Will you let us stay?" she asked, her voice no louder than wind through dry grass. I crouched so we were eye to eye. The fire cracked behind us, warm on my back. "For now," I said softly. as long as you need to catch your breath. She seemed to weigh this. Children forced to grow up too fast learn to measure truth in a man's tone, not his words. After a moment, she nodded, small, cautious, but real. The mother's head lowered, relief and worry dancing across her face in the same instant. Behind her quiet gratitude, a storm still brewed, fear of who might follow, of what kindness might cost. I offered bread and what was left of my dried apples. The girl took them politely, handing half to her mother before touching the baby's cheek. The baby stirred, a faint sigh escaping cracked lips, and for a heartbeat, the girl's face lit up with something close to joy. I watched them, unseen in my own house, how easily they leaned toward each other, even in exhaustion, shoulders brushing, glances shared, an unspoken language of care. They had learned to survive by holding tight to each other, and I wondered what it would take to pull them apart. As the morning brightened, I went to the barn to check my mare. The door creaked, the smell of straw and old wood wrapping around me like memory. Dust motes danced in slants of sunlight, and for a moment, it felt almost peaceful until I caught movement at the edge of the trees. A crow, black and silent, shifting its wings on a bare branch, its gaze fixed on the cabin, head cocked as if listening. Just a bird, I told myself. But in the hush of these hills, even a bird felt like a warning. I walked the fence line, boots sinking in thawed earth, eyes scanning the ridges for dust trails or glints of metal. Nothing. Yet the unease settled heavier in my chest with each step. They wouldn't have run this far if no one was chasing. When I returned, the girl was by the window staring out at the same trees I just passed. She turned when she heard my boots, her small body tensing. "Do you think they'll find us?" she whispered. The question hung in the air, sharp and cold. I wanted to lie, to say no, not here. But lies cost more than truth in places like this. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we'll be ready if they do." The words seemed to steady her. She drew a slow breath, nodded, and moved back to her mother's side. Inside the cabin, the mother tried to shift the baby, wincing at the effort. I stepped forward, palm open, offering to help. Her eyes searched minute deep, tired, mistrusting, but desperate too. Finally, she let me hold the bundle. The baby weighed almost nothing, a bundle of bones and fever warmth. Its breath fluttered against my wrist so faint it made my heart squeeze tight. In its tiny face, I saw the raw cost of running, of hiding, of fear lived too long. "What's his name?" I asked, voice barely above a breath. The mother hesitated, then whispered, "Samuel." Samuel, a small human word in the hush of the wild. I handed the child back gently, careful not to jostle the shallow rhythm of his breathing. The mother's fingers brushed mine, calloused and cold but alive. She whispered again this time, almost too soft to hear. "Mary." Her name, and as if to finish the chain, the girl stepped forward. "I'm Elsie." 3 names, a gift of trust given in pieces. I nodded, holding them close in silence. "I'm Jesse." I offered back, the name tasting strange on my tongue after so much solitude. For a long moment, nothing moved but the fire's dance. Then, outside, a branch cricket, a sharp, unnatural sound. All 3 of them froze. My hand found the rifle propped by the door, muscles tightening. Silence swallowed the room. Even the baby seemed to hold its breath. I stepped to the window, careful not to stir the curtain. Beyond the fence, the trees stood still, shadows stretched long by afternoon light. Nothing moved, but the peace of morning was gone, replaced by something brittle and taut. When I turned back, Mary's eyes met mine, wide with unspoken terror. Elsie clung to her mother's sleeve, knuckles white. "They've come before," Mary whispered, her voice like wind through dry leaves. I tightened my grip on the rifle, heart drumming hard. Then they know where to look. The fire hissed softly, shadows shifting across the floor. In that moment, we all understood. The quiet had been a mercy, and mercy rarely lasts long in these hills. Outside, a crow took wing, its cry tearing through the silencia, sound that felt too much like a warning to ignore. Afternoon bled into evening, and shadows grew long and thin across the clearing. The quiet had settled around the cabin, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the heavy hush of breath held too long. Every floorboard seemed to creak louder than it should. Every gust of wind rattling the window shutters felt like a hand at the door. I took to walking the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning the tree line for anything out of place. I'd lived on this patch of land for years. I knew every stump, every bend in the fence, every deer trail that cut through the underbrush. But even so, the unease wouldn't leave me. As the sun dropped behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised purples and burning orange, I found what I didn't want to find. A broken branch, fresh sap still wet on the splintered wood. Near it, an impression in the dirt shallow, but shaped like the iron curve of a horse's shoe. No wild animal would have done that. I knelt beside it, my breath misting in the cooling air. Someone had been close enough to see the cabin if they knew where to look, and then they'd pulled back, leaving only this sign for someone willing to notice. When I returned to the cabin, Elsie was sitting cross-legged on the floor near the hearth, the baby bundled against her mother's chest. Mary looked up as I entered. Something in my face must have given me away. "What is it?" she asked, voice thin and tight. "Could be nothing." I lied first, but the words tasted wrong. I shook my head. Found sign of a rider, close by. The girl's breath caught, eyes darting to the window as if she might see danger looming there. Mary's hand tightened around the baby so fiercely, his small cry pierced the air before he settled again. "They've found us," Mary whispered, her face a mask of exhaustion and fear. "God help us, they've found us." "Tell me who," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Who's hunting you?" Mary's eyes glistened in the firelight, the lines of hardship carved deep into her face. For a long moment, I thought she'd stay silent, but at last she spoke, words tumbling out like stones loosened from a cliff. "My husband's brother," she said, "a man with no kindness in him. After my husband died, he wanted the land, wanted us gone. When I wouldn't sign it over, Her voice broke. She swallowed hard, then went on. "He took to violence. First threats, then fire. We fled before he could finish what he started." "Where's the land?" I asked. "Missouri," she replied, the syllables falling heavy. "Near the river. It's nothing fancy, just soil and timber. But he wanted it badly enough to chase us across 2 states. And he won't stop," I murmured, more to myself than to her. Mary's eyes met mine, dark wells of grief and iron resolve. "Not until he thinks we're dead," she said. The baby stirred, coughing, a thin, rattling sound that made my chest tighten. Elsie leaned closer, pressing her small hand against his back, whispering to calm him. "How long has he been ill?" I asked. "Since before we left Missouri," Mary answered, voice raw. "The road's been too hard on him. Cold nights, little food." My gaze drifted over them. A woman worn thin, a daughter carrying fear heavier than her years, a baby fighting just to keep breathing. It was a sight to split a man's heart in 2. Outside, dusk surrendered to night. Stars blinked awake in the sky, and the moon hung low, swollen and yellow, over the hills. I lit a single lantern, its circle of light pushing back the darkness just enough to see each other's faces. "Best we keep watch tonight," I said. "I can help," Elsie offered, voice trembling but brave. "You've helped enough today," I told her gently. "Stay near your mother. I'll keep my eyes on the dark." She hesitated, then nodded and moved closer to Mary. I took the rifle from its place by the door and settled into the rocker near the window, its wood worn smooth by years of quiet nights that had never felt so loud as this one. Hours stretched out, the crackle of the fire marking time. My eyes drifted over to them often, Mary holding Samuel close, whispering old lullabies in a voice turned hoarse by fear. Elsie fighting sleep, her head bobbing before jerking upright again and again. Finally, exhaustion overcame her, and she curled against Mary's side, lashes soft on her cheeks. Mary's gaze met mine over the small heads of her children. "Why do you help us?" she whispered. I thought about lying, about saying something simple like, "It's the right thing." But truth felt better here, under this roof where every word mattered. "Because once," I said, "someone helped me. And I remember what it feels like when the world forgets your name." Mary's eyes glistened, and for the first time, she let out a breath that wasn't held back by fear. "Thank you," she whispered again, softer this time, as if she finally believed it wouldn't cost her everything. Night deepened. Beyond the glass, the world held its breath. The trees stood watch, black against the star-flecked sky, their branches whispering secrets to the wind. Then, just past midnight, the sound came, the sharp clink of iron striking stone. The blood drained from my face. I rose, rifle in hand, and moved to the door. Mary pulled Elsie closer, pressing a hand over the girl's mouth to keep any sound from escaping. Another sound followed, a scuff of dirt, faint but unmistakable. I peered out, my breath caught in my throat. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the fence, a figure sat atop a horse, still as stone, watching the cabin. The moon cast enough light to see the glint of metal at his side-ear rifle, resting easy but ready. For a moment that felt like eternity, we faced each other across the cold distance, me in the doorway, him in the saddle. Then he turned the horse, melting back into the shadows of the trees. The darkness swallowed him whole. I shut the door softly, heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake the boards beneath my feet. "They know where we are," I said, voice rough. Mary's face paled. "What do we do?" I looked at them, the girl, the baby, the woman who had walked through fire to keep them alive, and the answer formed heavy as iron. "We fight," I said, "or we run. But either way, we don't wait for them to come knocking." Outside, an owl called across the night, its lonely cry echoing through the hollows. In the quiet that followed, we all understood. By dawn, everything would change. The dawn did not bring relief. Instead, it came wrapped in a suffocating silence that pressed against my chest like a stone. We had not slept, none of us. I kept the rifle close, senses razor sharp, listening for the slightest crack of a twig or whisper of a footstep beyond the tree line. Mary was pale, a ghost of herself, clutching little Samuel so tightly his ribs might have bruised under the pressure. Elsie had curled into a tight ball on the floorboards, her fingers twitching in restless dreams. "Do you think he'll come back?" Mary asked, voice barely above a breath. I looked out the window again, searching the dense woods, but found nothing. "If he wants us dead," I said, "he will." The morning light spilled weakly through the fog, painting the clearing in muted grays and whites. It was a landscape emptied of color, like the promise of a new day had been stolen in the night. I stepped outside, the chill biting at my skin. My boots crunched on frost-hardened earth. I moved to the spot where I'd seen the ride of the broken branch, the horse's shoe print embedded in the soil. But now, something else caught my eye. Near the footprints, a scrap of cloth fluttered on a thorn bush, dirty and torn. I reached out, my fingers brushing the frayed fabric, a dark green, the kind worn by men who thought themselves hunters of men. Back inside, I laid the cloth on the table. Mary stared at it, eyes wide. "He's closer than we thought." A silence settled between us, heavy and unspoken. This was no longer just a chase. It was a war, one we were ill prepared for. "We can't stay here," I said quietly. "If they know this place, they'll come back with others." Mary nodded, her lips pressed tight. "Where would we go?" I hesitated. The land around was vast, but the woods could hide enemies as easily as us. "I know a place," I said at last. "An old logging camp, about 10 miles east. Abandoned, but sturdy. No one goes there anymore." 10 miles, Mary whispered, weighing the distance and the risk. "It's our best chance." Elsie stirred, rubbing her eyes. "I don't want to leave," she said, voice small and trembling. "I want to stay with you." Mary pulled her close, brushing back her tangled hair. I know, honey, but we have to be smart. It's not safe here. Packing what little we had took hours. Samuel was wrapped in blankets, soothed by Mary's soft humming, though the fear in her eyes betrayed the melody's false comfort. I checked my rifle, loaded every cartridge. The sun was high, but the heat did little to lift the heavy air. We slipped out the back door, stepping lightly into the wilderness. The trees swallowed us. As we moved, leaves crunching softly underfoot. The forest was a world of shadows and whispers. Birds flitted through the canopy, startled by our passage. Somewhere a creek babbled, a small thread of sound in the vast quiet. I led the way, eyes always scanning, heart pounding a steady rhythm of alertness and dread. After an hour, the land changed. The trees grew thicker, more twisted, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers. The scent of pine mixed with damp earth, the smell of decay. We paused by a fallen log, catching our breath. Elsie clung to Mary's hand, her wide eyes reflecting the filtered sunlight. "Do you think he'll find us here?" Elsie asked, her voice barely a whisper. I knelt, looking into her frightened face. "If he does, we'll be ready." We pushed on, deeper into the woods. The logging camp lay ahead, a ghost of its former self. Crumbling cabins, rusted equipment half swallowed by vines, and the skeleton of a watchtower standing guard over the clearing. I led them through the ruins, finding the most intact cabin. The roof sagged, but the walls held. We barred the door with a fallen beam, stacking old crates against the windows. Inside, the air was stale, the dust thick. We cleared a space near the fireplace and started a small fire. The smoke curled upward, twisting into the cracked ceiling. Mary sat by the fire, warming her hands. "I don't know how much longer we can keep running," she said, voice fragile. "We won't have to," I said, meeting her eyes. "We make a stand here." Elsie looked up, hope flickering in her gaze. "A stand?" "Yes," I said. "We protect each other. We fight if we have to." Hours passed in uneasy silence. The forest outside darkened, and the wind began to whisper through the broken windows. Suddenly, a sharp crack shattered the stillness, a twig snapping beneath heavy boots. I grabbed the rifle, motioning for Mary and Elsie to stay low. The door rattled as a shadow loomed. "Who's there?" I called, voice steady but low. No answer. The door pushed slowly, groaning as it opened just enough to let a figure slip inside. A man tall and gaunt, eyes burning with cold fury. "Thought you could hide," he said, voice rough like gravel. Mary gasped. Elsie pressed herself into Mary's side, trembling. The man smiled, cruel and empty. "You're coming home." I raised the rifle, heart hammering. He laughed, low and bitter. "You won't shoot." "Not me." But I did. The report echoed through the cabin, deafening. The man fell, a dark stain spreading across his shirt. Silence. Then a faint groan. He was alive. Mary screamed, and I realized this fight was far from over. The echo of the gunshot had barely faded when the cabin plunged into a hollow silence so deep it seemed to suck the very breath from the air. My hands shook as I lowered the rifle, eyes locked on the man sprawled on the floor, a dark pool blossoming beneath him. He didn't move at first. Then a ragged cough tore through the quiet. Blood bubbled at the corner of his cracked lips, staining his chin. "Alive," I muttered under my breath, heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, desperate to break free. Mary shrank back, clutching Elsie tighter, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of terror and disbelief. The man's face twisted in pain and fury. "You think that'll stop me?" He spat, each word dripping venom. I tightened my grip on the rifle's stock. "It has to." He left head a harsh, bitter sound that scraped against my nerves like sandpaper. "You don't know what you've gotten yourself into." "Then tell me," I said, voice cold. His eyes darkened, the shadow of a smirk flickering before pain stole it away. "This isn't about you or her," he wheezed, nodding toward Mary and the baby. "It's about what she carries." "What do you mean?" Mary's voice was barely audible. He coughed again, clutching his chest. Bloodline. Power. You don't understand, but that child, he jerked a thumb towards Samuel, is more than flesh and bone. She's a key. I felt a chill snake down my spine. A key to what? Old debts, blood feuds, the sins of a father's past, Elsie whimpered, hiding behind Mary's skirts. I stared down at him, the weight of his words pressing on me. I wanted to dismiss the madness, the wild talk of bloodlines and debts, but something in his gaze told me otherwise. This was no ordinary man, no ordinary enemy. The fire flickered, casting monstrous shadows on the walls, as if the cabin itself held its breath. He tried to sit up, but weakness overtook him. I'm not the only one coming, he warned. They're already hunting. The name Clayton Cutter burned in my Minda specter, stalking our every step. Mary's hands trembled as she brushed a strand of hair from Elsie's face. Then we have to move. Now. I nodded, urgency prickling every nerve. We gathered our things swiftly. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a coffin closing in around us. Outside, the forest was alive with whispers, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a hawk. I took point, rifle ready, heart pounding like war drums. We moved through the woods with silent steps, shadows among shadows. Every snap of a branch, every distant call set my nerves on edge. The logging camp was behind us now. The wilderness stretched endlessly ahead. Mary carried Samuel, her arms steady but worn. Elsie clung to me as we pushed forward, deeper into the unknown. Night fell like a curtain, swallowing the path and cloaking us in darkness. We huddled beneath a fallen tree, fireflies flickering like lost souls. I'm sorry, Mary whispered, tears shining in the moonlight, for bringing this into your life. I shook my head. You didn't choose this, but I'll keep you safe, all of you. Her eyes searched mine, finding in them a fragile promise. We shared what little food we had, hard biscuits and dried meat, swallowed with dry mouths and heavier thoughts. Sleep came in fits and starts, each one haunted by dreams of shadowed figures and whispered threats. Morning brought no relief. The sun struggled to pierce the dense canopy. We pressed on, moving faster, driven by the knowledge that the enemy was closing in. By midday, the signs were clear, broken branches, footprints in the mud, the unmistakable scent of smoke. We were not alone. The forest around us seemed to conspire against our flight, twisting and turning into a labyrinth. I felt the weight of responsibility settle like lead in my chest. I was a stranger to these woods, a man with no claim to this land, yet here I was, charged with protecting two fragile lives. Can we trust anyone? Mary asked one evening, as we paused beside a trickling stream. Not anymore, I said. Trust is a luxury we can't afford. Elsie stared into the water, her small fingers tracing patterns in the mud. I wish things were different, she said softly. Me too, I whispered. The days blurred together, a constant dance of survival. We scavenged for food, drank from streams, and kept moving. The bond between us grew stronger, forged in the fire of shared fear and hope. Mary's strength amazed me. Despite everything, she never let despair claim her. Elsie too found moments of light, carving small wooden animals from fallen branches, humming songs that echoed through the trees. Samuel, fragile and quiet, grew stronger with each passing day, but the shadow of Clayton Cutter loomed large. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, we heard a distant howl, a pack moving closer. I tightened my grip on the rifle. We need to find shelter. Now. We stumbled upon a cave hidden beneath a ridgy dark mouth yawning in the rock. It was cold and damp, but better than the open forest. We settled inside, building a fire that cast flickering light on the rough stone walls. The night stretched long and restless. Outside, the howls grew louder, echoing off the cliffs. Sleep was elusive. I kept watch, every sense alert. At dawn, we emerged, hearts heavy with the knowledge that the hunt was far from over. Our journey was just beginning. The cave was a hollow in the earth, a cold sanctuary carved by centuries of weather and water. I never thought I'd find comfort in damp stone walls, but that night it was the closest thing to safety we had. The fire we lit sputtered and cast long shadows that danced like ghosts across the jagged walls. Mary sat close to the baby, whispering soft lullabies I didn't understand, while Elsie curled against my side, her small body trembling beneath a threadbare coat. I tried to settle my thoughts, but the weight of Clayton Cutter's threat pressed against me like the cold stone beneath us. His words echoed in my mind, the idea that the child was more than flesh and bone, a key to old debts and blood feuds. I wanted to dismiss it, to believe that our troubles were purely earthly and straightforward, but the way his eyes glinted with a dangerous knowledge made me wonder if there was something darker beneath it all. The forest outside was silent, save for the distant calls of birds waking to a new day. But the calm was brittle, like a thin sheet of ice that could shatter underfoot at any moment. "Why do you stay?" Mary asked suddenly, her voice low and steady, breaking the fragile quiet. I looked at her, tired but resolute. "Because I don't have anywhere else to be. Because I made a promise." She nodded, eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "You're a good man." I let the words hang between us, unspoken fears and gratitude mingling in the smoke-filled air. No one had called me that in a long time. The days following our refuge in the cave were a brutal test of endurance. Food was scarce, the forest unforgiving. We scavenged roots and berries, caught what little game we could with makeshift traps, and drank cautiously from streams, always mindful of predators both animal and human. Mary carried Samuel with a tenderness that was almost sacred. Each breath the baby took was a small victory. Elsie, though young, carried an old soul's quiet strength. She kept a wooden horse she'd carved from a fallen branch, a simple thing, but it seemed to carry her hope. One afternoon, while foraging near a thicket, I spotted footprints too large for any animal, too deep for a child. My heart clenched. We were not alone. Clayton's men were moving closer, their presence like a shadow creeping across the land. I took Mary and Elsie by the hand, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "We need to move, now." We traveled by night, the stars our only guides. The forest darkness was a cloak, but also a prison. The crunch of leaves beneath our feet sounded like thunder in my ears. Every rustle, every snap set my nerves on edge. Sleep became a memory, replaced by restless vigilance. My dreams were haunted by the specter of Clayton Cutter, his sneer, the coldness in his eyes, the promise of violence that followed him like a storm cloud. Mary whispered one night as we huddled beneath the canopy, "Do you think we'll ever be safe again?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was, safety was a luxury we had lost the day we fled. Elsie looked up at me, her eyes bright with a mixture of fear and determination. "We have to be brave. For Samuel." Her innocence and courage hit me like a punch to the gut. This child, so young, already carrying the weight of survival on her small shoulders. As we pressed on, I noticed changes in Mary, moments of quiet resolve, flashes of a steel edge beneath her gentle exterior. The past had broken her, but it had also forged something fierce. One evening, we came across an abandoned cabin, hidden in a grove of pines. It was small and run down, but it had walls and a roof, a chance for shelter. We entered cautiously, the stale air thick with dust and the scent of forgotten lives. I cleared a corner near the fireplace, laying down some of our sparse blankets. Mary settled Samuel gently, singing a hymn her mother had taught her long ago. Elsie sat beside her, tracing the faded patterns in the wood floor with restless fingers. That night, for the first time in days, I allowed myself to close my eyes, if only for a moment. The weight of the rifle beside me, the soft breathing of the children nearby, a fragile peace hung in the air. But peace was an illusion. At dawn, I spotted fresh tracks near the cabin, human, purposeful. Clayton Cutter was coming. I stood outside, the chill of morning biting at my skin, eyes fixed on the tree line. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a reckoning. I bowed then beneath the pale, uncaring sky, that no shadow, no matter how dark or violent, would claim these lives. Mercy was more than a name. She was a promise, and I was going to keep it. Dawn broke cold and gray, the light seeping through the pines like a hesitant promise. The cabin sat silent, a fragile island in a sea of wilderness that suddenly felt more hostile. I moved slowly outside, the rifle feeling heavier with every breath. The tracks were fresh, too fresh. The hunt was closing in, and the forest that once offered refuge now whispered danger in every breeze. Mary's eyes were red from sleepless nights, her hands trembling as she cradled Samuel close. Elsie, though young, had become the silent sentinel, watching the shadows with a fierce protectiveness that surprised me more than once. I thought about the stories I'd heard as a boy, tales of families torn apart by violence, of men chasing blood debts across unforgiving lands. Clayton Cutter was no legend. He was the living embodiment of that nightmare. His cruelty wasn't just about power. It was personal, venomous, a storm that didn't forget or forgive. I could still hear the weight of his threats from our last encounter, how his voice carried the bitter promise of a man who believed the world owed him everything. But I was done running. Whatever fight came next, I had to stand. We made the decision to leave the cabin by midday. Staying meant waiting for Clayton's men to find us. Running was dangerous, but the forest shadows still held a sliver of hope. I packed what little supplies we had, wrapped Samuel in the warmest blankets, and gathered Mary and Elsie close. The path ahead was rough, winding through thick underbrush and across rocky streams. Every step felt like walking on a thin line between life and death. The baby's fragile breaths were my anchor, each one a reminder that mercy wasn't just a name, it was a lifeline. That night, beneath a sky smeared with stars, I lit a small fire hidden behind thick shrubs. The flames flickered, casting uncertain light on Mary's face. She hummed a tune I didn't recognize, a haunting melody that seemed to pull at the edges of my memory. I thought about the world outside our hiding places, places where cruelty wore a mask of civility, where children were born into storms not of their making. But here, with these two girls and the baby, I found something I hadn't expected, a fragile hope. Elsie traced the edges of a scar on her hand, a souvenir from a fall days before. She didn't complain, she never did. It was as if pain was just another shadow she'd learned to live with. We spoke little, words scarce as the food we had. Instead, there were glances, small gestures, Mary tightening a blanket around Samuel, Elsie handing me a sharpened stick she'd carved, a silent promise of resilience. I kept watch that night, eyes sharp in the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of horses broke the silence. My heart thudded, cold dread flooding my veins. Clayton's men were near. I woke the girls gently, no time for whispers or fear. We moved swiftly, shadows slipping through the trees like ghosts. The forest was alive with sounds, the crackle of twigs, the rustle of leaves, the distant cries of animals startled by our flight. Hours passed in a blur of exhaustion and caution. At one point, Mary stopped, holding Samuel close, whispering prayers I couldn't understand. Her voice cracked, but the faith behind it was unbreakable. Elsie walked beside me, clutching the wooden horse, eyes scanning the woods with a sharpness that belied her age. She was no longer just a child. She was a protector in her own right. By dawn, we reached a ridge, overlooking a wide valley. The landscape stretched before us like a vast promise of rolling hills, patches of forest, and a river winding like a silver thread through the earth. It was beautiful, but I knew better than to trust beauty. We'll rest here, I decided, my voice rough, but only for a little while. Mary nodded, exhaustion etched into her face. Samuel slept fitfully, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. As I stood watch, my mind drifted back to the day we first met, to the fear in Mary's eyes, and the fierce determination that had grown from it. The journey had changed us. Each step carved new lines into our souls, but also forged bonds that no threat could break. The distant sound of hooves shattered the fragile calm. Clayton was coming, and this time there would be no running. I tightened my grip on the rifle, steeling myself for the battle ahead. Mercy wasn't just a child now. She was a beacon, and I was ready to fight for her light. The ridge was our last sanctuary before the valley dropped away into unknown dangers. I never liked how the world looked from up high, too much exposed, too many places to hide from you. But for now, it was all we had. Mary clutched Mercy close, her face pale but resolute. Elsie sat beside her, knees drawn up, still clutching that wooden horse. I tried to steady my breathing, but my mind raced like a storm in the night, each thought worse than the last. Clayton's shadow wasn't far behind. I could feel it creeping closer, relentless as winter frost creeping under a door. I walked the perimeter slowly, rifle slung over my shoulder, ears tuned to the forest's whispers. The trees stood still, the air heavy with silence, the kind that precedes violence. I kept thinking back to how we ended up here, a trio, bound not by blood, but by desperation and a shared hunger for survival. Mary, a mother stripped of everything but willpower. Elsie, a child forced to grow up too fast. And Mercy, the fragile spark flickering between hope and despair. Clayton's cruelty had left scars on all of us. Not just the bruises visible on Mary's skin, but the wounds carved deep into our souls. At one point, I caught Mary watching the valley below, eyes distant. She was still fighting her own ghosts, shadows that no amount of firelight or whispered prayers could chase away. I wanted to tell her it would be okay, that this time she wouldn't be alone. But words felt hollow. Elsie, despite her youth, had become a quiet pillar. I caught her once, standing by the edge of the ridge, her small fists clenched like she was ready to face whatever came. She had learned too early that sometimes courage was all you had left. The sun dipped low behind the trees, the golden hour casting long shadows. The valley below glowed with the last light, but I knew that darkness was creeping in from all sides. We prepared what little food we had, but hunger gnawed at us all. Mercy stirred, her tiny breath shallow but steady. That child was our reason, the light we couldn't afford to lose. Night fell with a sudden chill. We huddled close, sharing blankets and warmth, but sleep was a stranger. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. At some point, I found myself talking to Mercy in whispers, promising her safety in a world that didn't feel safe anymore. Promises made to a child who didn't understand the weight they carried. Then came the sound, low, distant, but unmistakable. Hooves, horses, too many. Clayton's men were coming, hunting like wolves. I didn't wait for them to find us. I woke Mary and Elsie, and with Mercy swaddled tightly in my arms, we moved deeper into the woods, slipping through shadows and fallen leaves. The forest became a maze, but I knew it like the lines on my hands. We ducked behind fallen logs, crossed cold streams, and climbed over jagged rocks. Every moment, a battle against exhaustion and fear. Mercy's cries broke through the night, once a fragile wail that nearly tore my heart apart. Mary soothed her with trembling hands, whispering words I couldn't hear but knew were prayers. The men's voices grew louder, their shouts cutting through the darkness. I could hear Clayton's voice, harsh, angry, a storm fueled by rage, and a sense of ownership twisted by years of cruelty. We ran harder, branches slapping our faces, roots threatening to trip us. Elsie stumbled once, but Mary caught her before she fell. The chase felt endless, a nightmare with no waking. My legs burned, lungs gasping for air, but I couldn't stop. At one point, we found ourselves at the edge of a cliff, the valley yawning below like an abyss. The cold wind bit into our skin, carrying the scent of pine and danger. We had nowhere left to run. I set Mercy down carefully on a bed of moss, wrapping her in every blanket we had. Mary took Elsie's hand, and we prepared for whatever was coming. The first horseman broke through the trees like a shadow made flesh, Clayton himself, eyes blazing with fury. The others followed, men with faces hardened by violence, weapons drawn, their intent clear. I raised my rifle, heart pounding. This was the moment, the fight we'd been running from since that first desperate night. Mary stood beside me, a ghost of the woman I first met, battered but unbroken. Elsie's hand tightened around mine. Mercy's eyes fluttered open, the tiniest spark of life shining in the darkness. I steadied my aim. The forest held its breath. And the storm broke. The air cracked with tension, thick and choking, as Clayton's men pressed in. The night had folded around us like a shroud, every shadow now a threat, every breath a gamble. I stood firm, rifle poised, but my hands weren't steady, the weight of what was at stake pressed down hard. Mercy, fragile and tiny, lay wrapped close in blankets, the faintest flicker of life still clinging to her chest. Mary's eyes burned with a mix of fear and steel. She had come so far from the broken woman who first stepped into my cabin, bloodied and desperate. Tonight she was a mother ready to fight for her child's chance to live. Elsie clutched my arm, her small fingers trembling, but she held her ground. She was no longer just a scared girl, she was a guardian of hope. Clayton's voice sliced through the silence, thick with venom. "You think you can hide from me? This ends now." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind raced through everything, the endless nights of watching over Mercy's shallow breaths, the moments of silent understanding between us, the firelight reflecting off Mary's bruised face, the way Elsie's carved wooden horse never left her side. Then the first shot rang out sharp, loud, shattering the stillness. I returned fire, not aiming to kill but to warn, to hold them back long enough for a chance. They surged forward, reckless and furious. I felt the rush of adrenaline flood through me, instinct sharpened by years surviving this unforgiving land. Mary grabbed a fallen branch, swinging it fiercely, eyes wild, a cry escaping her lips that was half fear, half fury. Elsie ducked behind a tree, steadying her breath. Mercy whimpered, a soft sound that broke my focus, pulling me back to what mattered. We fought with everything we had, broken bodies, raw will, a desperate refusal to give in. Clayton advanced, his face a mask of rage and hatred, but something in his eyes flickered confusion, doubt. Maybe he saw what I saw, that we were no longer victims, that we were fighters, born from pain and survival. In the chaos, Mary shoved Clayton back, her strength surprising even herself. I tackled one of his men, the world narrowing to the feel of rough hands and cold steel. Suddenly, a shot echoed closer this time, not from me. A voice barked commands, horses thundered into the clearing, and the sheriff's deputies poured in, guns drawn, faces set. Clayton's men faltered, their confidence cracking under the sudden onslaught. The sheriff grabbed Clayton by the collar, hauling him roughly to his feet. "You're under arrest," the sheriff said flatly, eyes cold. Clayton spat blood and curses, but he was done. The tension dissolved, replaced by a heavy silence as the men were led away, chains clinking. I lowered my rifle, slowly, chest heaving. Mary collapsed to her knees, pulling Mercy close, tears spilling free for the first time in weeks. Elsie sat beside her, exhausted but smiling faintly. I looked at them, three souls bound by struggle, by loss, by the fierce need to live. The dawn was breaking, spilling pink and gold across the sky. Mercy stirred again, stronger this time, her tiny fingers curling around Mary's. We had survived the night. We had found something worth fighting for. Mary looked up at me, voice trembling but full of hope. "She has a name now." I nodded. "We'll call her Mercy." And it wasn't just a name, it was a promise. A symbol of everything we'd lost and everything we still had: courage, compassion, a chance to start again. We watched the sun rise, its light painting the world in colors of rebirth. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time we weren't alone. Together, we would face whatever came next. Because in a world built on fear and violence, sometimes all it takes is mercy to change everything. The dawn stretched wide and slow, a soft light spilling over the valley like a gentle promise. The world was quiet now, but beneath the silence was a rhythm, steady, breathing, alive. I sat on the porch steps, watching Mary rock Mercy in her arms, the baby's fragile chest rising and falling with new strength. It wasn't the same world as before, not for any of us. The scars on our skin and souls would stay, some faded, some deep and raw, but the weight on our hearts was lighter now. We had crossed a dark valley, and while the sun didn't erase every shadow, it made the way forward visible. I found Elsie nearby, her small hands busy carving another figure from a piece of wood, a horse again, but this one different, more confident. She glanced up, eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, words weren't needed. We understood. We had survived. We had rebuilt. The sheriff's men had taken Clayton Cutter and his crew into custody before the sun fully rose. I knew justice would be slow and imperfect, but for once, the law wasn't blind. The threat that haunted us was finally behind bars, and the long nightmare could begin to heal. Mary's face had softened in the light, shadows of fear replaced with cautious hope. I remembered the woman who had first appeared at my door, barefoot and broken, carrying a baby barely clinging to life. That woman was gone. In her place stood a mother, fierce, determined, a force born from love and pain. Mercy stood in her arms, eyes fluttering open to the warmth of morning. The tiny fingers grasped Mary's, a silent declaration of survival. The name Mercy was more than a word. It was a symbol of the path we had chosen. Not hatred, not fear, but compassion, courage, renewal. As I watched them, I thought of all the nights spent guarding that fragile life, the whispered prayers, the quiet moments of dread. It was a long road from desperation to hope, but here, on this porch, surrounded by the first light of day, it felt like the journey was worth every step. Elsie came closer, holding out the carved horse. "For Mercy," she said simply. I smiled, accepting the small gift. It was imperfect but beautiful, a testament to growth, to healing, to the simple things that held meaning after everything else was lost. The world around us was waking. Birds began their songs, timid but sure. The wind moved softly through the trees, carrying scents of pine and earth and rain yet to come. The old cabin, once a refuge, now felt like a home, rough and weathered but alive with promise. We'd faced darkness together, a ruthless man, a haunted past, the crushing weight of survival. But now, with the dawn, there was a new story waiting to be written. One where Mercy could grow, where Mary could heal, where Elsie could laugh without fear. I stood slowly, the porch creaking beneath my boots. I looked at them, the small family forged in fire and silence, and knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring its own battles. Life would not be easy or fair, but we had found strength in each other, in Mercy. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. As the sun climbed higher, I took a deep breath, the sharp, clean air of a world reborn, and stepped forward into whatever came next. Because in the end, the fiercest battles weren't fought with guns or anger. They were fought in the quiet moments, choosing to hope, choosing to protect, choosing to live. Mercy's name echoed softly in my mind, a reminder that even in the darkest dust there is light. And that light was ours now to carry. If you were in his boots, would you fight the same battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like the video. Explore the other videos on your screen. There are more stories waiting to pull you in.